Coldwater Penitentiary was the kind of place that lived in whispers. Sitting on the outskirts of a small southern town, its gray concrete walls rose like a fortress against the horizon. To most people in town, it was just another prison, another necessary evil. But to the women inside, Coldwater was a living nightmare. Its long corridors echoed with footsteps that never hurried, only dragged, and the smell of bleach never quite masked the deeper scent of despair. On a late summer night, when the cicadas outside buzzed in the thick, humid air, the prison alarms cut through the silence. The sound was shrill, frantic, wrong. Guards rushed through the corridors, their radios crackling with overlapping voices. "Unit D. Get to Unit D now," one of them shouted, boots slamming against the floor. In that single night, 4 women, all of them pregnant, were found dead in their cells. The discovery didn't just shake the prison. It shook the entire state. One of the guards, pale and trembling, leaned against the wall as the first body was wheeled out under a white sheet. "This doesn't make sense," he whispered to his partner. "For at once. This ain't no coincidence." His words hung in the air, heavier than the stench of disinfectant. Inside the cell block, panic spread like wildfire. Inmates banged against the bars, some crying, others shouting accusations. "They killed them," one voice screamed. Another wailed, "We're next." The guards barked for order, but no one was listening. Fear had already taken hold. By dawn, word had spread beyond the prison walls. Reporters crowded the gates, their cameras flashing, demanding answers. Families of the inmates clung to the chain-link fence, desperate for news. The prison's warden, a stern man with silvering hair and a face carved from stone, stepped before the microphones. His statement was clipped, clinical, and unsatisfying. "It appears to be a tragic coincidence," he said. "The medical team is investigating possible complications related to pregnancy. We asked the public for patience." But no one believed it. Not the families, not the guards who had seen the terror in the women's eyes, and certainly not the detectives who arrived later that morning. Detective Laura McKinney, a sharp-eyed investigator with a reputation for seeing what others overlooked, stood in the corridor of Unit D. The cells were quiet now, eerily quiet. She ran her fingers across the cold steel bars, her jaw tightening. 4 women, she murmured. All pregnant. All dead in the same night. You don't get a pattern like that by chance. Her partner, Detective James Holloway, frowned as he flipped through his notepad. Warden says it's medical. Complications. Maybe bad food or water supply. Laura shot him a look that silenced him. You believe that? No, he admitted, lowering his voice. Not for a damn second. The camera in the corner of the hallway blinked with a steady red light, recording everything and nothing all at once. Neither detective could have known at that moment just how important those cameras would become. They weren't just silent witnesses. They were the only witnesses the women had left. Outside, the sun rose over the razor wire, casting long shadows across the prison yard. The world kept moving, but inside Coldwater, time seemed to stop. For lives were gone. For unborn children were gone. And with them came a chilling question no one could ignore. If the prison was supposed to keep people alive long enough to serve their time, then how did 4 women end up dead in the very place meant to guard them? For now, there were no answers. Only a haunting truth that everyone could feel, but no one dared to say aloud. Someone inside Coldwater Penitentiary was hiding something. And whatever it was, it had just left 4 bodies behind. Detective Laura McKinney believed that to understand a crime, you had to understand its victims. To her, they weren't just names on a report or numbers in a statistic. They were lives, each with a story, each with a future they would never see. And in Coldwater Penitentiary, the 4 women who died that night weren't just inmates. They were mothers-to-be, each carrying more than just their own broken pasts. They carried hope. The first was Angela Carter, 28 years old. Angela grew up in a working-class neighborhood on the west side of Birmingham. She had dreams once, big ones. She wanted to open a small bakery with her sister, to spend mornings rolling out dough instead of dodging trouble. But life, and bad choices, caught up with her. A minor drug charge, a plea deal, and suddenly she was wearing an orange jumpsuit. Despite that, Angela had been counting down the days to her release. She wrote letters to her mother every week, promising that once she got out, she would turn her life around. Her pregnancy, though shrouded in mystery, had given her a strange kind of light. This baby, She told her bunkmate weeks before her death, "This baby is my second chance." Then there was Marisol Reyes, 32, an immigrant from Honduras. She came to the United States chasing opportunity, but poverty and desperation led her into a series of mistakes. She had been locked up for shoplifting and fraud, nothing violent. Behind bars, Marisol kept to herself. She prayed every night in Spanish, clutching a small wooden cross until sleep overtook her. Her pregnancy had shocked the guards. She hadn't had visitors in months. "It's a miracle," she whispered to a fellow inmate one evening. "I don't know how, but God must have given me this child." To Marisol, that baby was proof that she wasn't forgotten, that somewhere in the darkness, something pure still existed. Tasha Williams was the youngest, only 24. She came from Atlanta, where the streets seemed hungrier than she was. Petty thefts, a string of bad influences, and she ended up inside Coldwater. Unlike the others, Tasha was fiery. She laughed loud, cursed louder, and carried herself like no one could break her. But the pregnancy had softened her. In the weeks leading up to her death, she wrote poems on scraps of paper, lines about becoming a mother, about wanting to be more than what the world had made of her. One of the guards later recalled hearing her whisper to her belly through the bars at night, "You and me, baby. We'll get out of here. We'll start over." The last was Clara Jennings, 35, once a licensed nurse before financial strain drove her into embezzlement. She wasn't hardened like the others. She was educated, articulate, the kind of woman who could have easily been on the other side of the bars. Clara often volunteered in the prison infirmary, helping with minor medical tasks, a way of clinging to who she used to be. But what haunted her most was the pregnancy. She knew biology, she knew medicine, and she knew the circumstances didn't add up. Weeks before her death, she confided in a fellow inmate, "I didn't ask for this. Something's wrong here. We're not safe. For women. For pregnancies. For lives extinguished in the same night." To the outside world, they were convicts, women who had made mistakes. But to their families, to the few who knew their stories, they were daughters, sisters, and mothers in waiting. And as Detective McKinney reviewed their files, she felt an ache in her chest. These weren't just cases. These were tragedies waiting to be understood. As she closed the folder, she looked at her partner and said quietly, "They wanted to be heard. They wanted someone to believe them. Now it's up to us." The camera in the corner blinked its silent light. Somewhere within hours of footage lay the truth of what happened to Angela, Marisol, Tasha, and Clara. But the real question, the one that kept Laura awake at night, wasn't just who killed them. It was why. Every prison has a heartbeat, and at Coldwater Penitentiary, that pulse belonged to Warden Samuel Harris. To the public, Harris was a man of order and discipline, the kind of leader who made the evening news whenever the governor needed to show strength on crime. He wore pressed uniforms, spoke in clipped phrases, and carried himself like a soldier who had seen too much and survived it all. Inside Coldwater, though, his presence was something else entirely. Inmates said you could feel when he entered a room. The air thickened, the conversation stopped, and even the guards straightened their posture. Harris was the law, the judge, and the executioner inside those walls. And everyone knew it. Detective McKinney studied his profile the morning after the 4 deaths. Harris stood in the warden's office, a place that looked more like a judge's chambers than a prison administrator's workspace. Polished oak desk, leather chairs, family photos carefully framed on the wall. Every detail screamed control. But it was his eyes that unsettled her. Cold, calculating, the kind of eyes that measured people not by who they were, but by how much use he could get out of them. "Detective," Harris said, his voice smooth but sharp at the edges, "I trust you understand the chaos we're managing here. For inmates gone at once. It's tragic, but prisons are volatile places. Bodies break. Minds break. Sometimes all at once." Laura didn't flinch. "They were all pregnant, Warden. That's not volatility. That's a pattern." For the first time, a flicker crossed his face. Annoyance. Then it was gone, replaced by the mask of authority he wore so well. "My staff is working with medical examiners. I expect a preliminary report in days. Until then, I suggest patience." Her partner, Detective Holloway, later muttered as they left, "Man talks like he's already written the report himself." But the detectives weren't the only ones suspicious. Rumors had long rippled through the prison. Inmates whispered that Harris ruled not just with iron bars, but with secrets. Some guards kept their distance, others bent under his will. "You don't cross the warden," one correctional officer had confided under his breath. "Cross him, and you won't last here. Hell, you might not last anywhere." At night, the cameras showed Harris walking the corridors, long after lights out, as if the prison belonged solely to him. He moved without hurry, keys jangling at his belt, stopping at cells for moments too brief to be casual, too deliberate to be meaningless. The guards on duty rarely questioned his movements. To them, Harris wasn't just their boss. He was the shadow they served. What unsettled Detective McKinney most was the contradiction. Outside Coldwater, Harris was a polished official. Inside, he was something darker, something that no record or resume could capture. And in the days following the deaths, that shadow seemed to spread. Guards who once looked steady now avoided eye contact. Files went missing. Medical notes were lost. And anyone who raised questions found themselves reassigned or silenced. It was in that suffocating environment that the detectives realized the truth. Finding out what happened to Angela, Marisol, Tasha, and Clara wouldn't just mean solving a case. It would mean taking on Harris himself. Standing in the prison yard as the sun sank behind the wire fences, Laura felt the weight of it pressing down on her. "He runs this place like a kingdom," she told Holloway. "And those women were his subjects. If we're right, they weren't just victims of circumstance. They were victims of power." Holloway nodded grimly. "And kingdoms don't fall easy." The cameras blinked silently overhead, recording Harris's every stride, his every turn. They didn't know it yet, but those same cameras would become the very thing that stripped his mask away. For now, though, Harris still reigned. And inside Coldwater, that meant fear. Detective Laura McKinney had seen her share of cover-ups, but something about Coldwater felt thicker, heavier, like trying to breathe underwater. Files were missing, autopsy requests delayed, medical notes misplaced. Every official explanation sounded like it had been written before the deaths even happened. Pregnancy complications, the prison physician insisted. A tragic coincidence. But Laura didn't buy it. Neither did Holloway. And as the walls seemed to close in, they realized the answers might not be found in paperwork or testimonies. They would be found in the eyes of the prison itself, the cameras. Coldwater was wired from top to bottom with surveillance. Every corridor, every cell block, every entrance and exit. For years, the prison boasted about its 24/7 monitoring system as proof of safety. Now, those very cameras might be the only witnesses the women had left. The detectives requested the footage from Unit D, the cell block where Angela, Marisol, Tasha, and Clara had spent their final hours. At first, the warden's office claimed the footage was corrupted. A convenient glitch. But persistence pays. After days of pressure, a junior tech reluctantly slid a hard drive across the table. "This is all we've got," he whispered. His eyes darted nervously toward the hallway, as if someone might be watching him too. Back in their office, Laura and Holloway huddled over the grainy black and white video. For hours, nothing happened. Just the slow crawl of guards, the shuffle of inmates, the eerie stillness of midnight. Then, at 2:17 a.m., movement. A man in uniform slipped into the frame. His face was shadowed, but his posture was unmistakable. Broad shoulders, the slow, deliberate gait of authority. He unlocked the door to Angela's cell. The camera had no audio, but the images spoke volumes. The guard, or whoever he was, leaned close to her, whispering something. Angela recoiled, pressing against the wall. Seconds later, he stepped inside, blocking the view. When he left, 20 minutes later, Angela lay curled on her cot, shaking. Laura froze the footage, her jaw tight. "That's not just a guard on rounds." Holloway leaned closer, whispering as if the man could hear them through the screen. "That's Harris. Look at the way he walks. That's him." The footage from the other cells showed the same haunting pattern. Marisol clutching her cross as the man entered. Tasha backing up to the bars, lips moving in what looked like a plea. Clara pacing, shaking her head furiously before the door swung open. Each encounter ended the same, with the man slipping out like a shadow, leaving the women broken in his wake. Laura's stomach churned. It wasn't proof of murder, not yet, but it was proof of something vile, something systemic. And it painted Harris not as a protector, but as a predator hiding behind authority. The detectives brought the footage to the district attorney. The DA, a hard-edged woman named Karen Stokes, stared at the screen in silence. When the final clip ended, she pushed back her chair and sighed. "This is explosive," she said. "But it's not enough. He'll say he was checking cells. He'll say it's procedure. Without audio, without context, it's his word against shadows." Laura clenched her fists. Shadows don't lie. These women were terrified. Look at their faces. Stokes shook her head. "I believe you. But to a jury, we need more than fear. We need a smoking gun." That night, Laura lay awake replaying the footage in her mind. The blinking light of the camera, the shadows moving in silence, the look of dread on the women's faces. For women who had tried to signal for help, but were trapped in a place where help never came. And then a thought struck her. Coldwater had dozens of cameras, some monitored, some forgotten. If one camera could show this much, what else had been recorded? Somewhere in those endless hours of footage, there had to be more. Something Harris didn't expect anyone to find. Laura turned to Holloway the next morning, her eyes burning with determination. "He thinks he's erased the truth. But the cameras were watching. We just have to know where to look." The hunt was no longer about 4 mysterious deaths. It was about unraveling a system of power, abuse, and silence. And the cameras, those silent witnesses, were finally beginning to speak. The footage had opened a door, but behind it was a hallway lined with darker truths. Detective Laura McKinney knew Harris couldn't have pulled this off alone. Coldwater was a fortress. Nothing happened inside without someone noticing. For women dead, for pregnancies that shouldn't have been possible, it spoke to something larger, something organized. The breakthrough came from a correctional officer named Eddie Barnes. He was young, barely 30, with tired eyes that made him look twice his age. When Laura first approached him, he wouldn't meet her gaze. "You don't understand," he muttered. "People disappear here. Guards, inmates, it doesn't matter. You cross Harris, you're done." But Laura pressed, her voice calm but firm. "4 women are gone, Officer Barnes. If you stay silent, it's not just your conscience that'll haunt you. One day, it'll be your name on a report. Do you want that?" For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his shoulders slumped, and the words spilled out. "It wasn't just him," Barnes whispered. "There's a whole system. Harris ran it. But others, we followed orders. He said they needed to be kept in line. God help me, we looked the other way when he went into those cells. Sometimes we helped." Laura felt her chest tighten. She asked quietly, "And the pregnancies?" Barnes swallowed hard. "They weren't accidents. He made sure of it. Said it kept the women quiet, kept them scared. They didn't dare complain when they were carrying." His voice cracked, and for the first time, the tough facade of a prison guard shattered. "And when they did talk, when they threatened to tell, that's when they ended up in the infirmary." Her words echoed in Laura's mind long after Barnes walked out of the interview room. But what truly shook the investigation was when an inmate, Sharon Davis, asked to speak with detectives. Unlike most, Sharon had nothing to gain. Her sentence was long, and parole was out of reach. Yet her eyes carried the haunted look of someone who had seen too much and could no longer keep it buried. "They were my friends," Sharon began, her voice trembling. "Angela, Marisol, Tasha, Clara. We shared meals, we prayed together, we tried to survive this place. And we all knew something was wrong. Harris came at night. Sometimes we heard the keys. Sometimes we saw the shadows under the doors. Nobody wanted to believe it, but," she paused, swallowing hard. "We knew." Laura leaned forward. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Tears slid down Sharon's face. "Because we were scared. I watched what happened to Clara. She told me once, if I disappear, you'll know why." The next week, she was gone. Everyone said she was sick. But I saw Elaine Porter leave her cell. I saw the syringe. The room went still. Sharon's hands shook as she pressed them together. "I should have said something then. Maybe it would have saved them. But when you're trapped in here, silence feels like the only way to stay alive." Holloway's jaw tightened, anger flashing across his face. "You're saying you witnessed Porter with the needle?" Sharon nodded slowly. "Yes. And Harris was there too. Watching. Like he wanted us to know he was untouchable." Her testimony didn't just confirm Barnes's confession, it humanized it. The terror wasn't abstract anymore. It was spoken through the voice of a survivor who carried the weight of guilt for living when 4 others hadn't. As Sharon was led back to her cell, Laura knew her words would echo in court louder than any file or footage. A survivor's voice had broken through the silence Harris had forced on everyone else. The infirmary. The name kept surfacing like a ghost. In Coldwater, it was supposed to be a place of healing, but rumors painted it as something else entirely. Inmates whispered about injections that made them sick, about medications that left them dizzy and weak. And at the center of it all was Nurse Elaine Porter. Elaine had been at Coldwater nearly as long as Harris. She was quiet, efficient, and fiercely loyal to the warden. On the surface, she was a caregiver, tending to coughs and cuts. But Barnes described something darker. She was his right hand, he said. If Harris wanted someone silenced, Elaine made it happen. Pills, shots, whatever he told her. Most times, the women didn't even know what they were being given. The picture was beginning to sharpen, a network of abuse, orchestrated from the top down. Harris was the king, the guards were his soldiers, and Elaine Porter was his enforcer. Together, they had turned Coldwater into a hunting ground, where women were prey and silence was the currency. Detective Holloway slammed his notebook shut after Barnes's confession. This isn't just corruption, he growled. This is organized assault. This is murder. Laura nodded, her eyes burning with anger. And it's been going on for years. But anger wasn't enough. They needed evidence. Confessions could be recanted. Testimony could be destroyed. Only proof could shatter Harris's empire. That proof came in the form of another guard, an older man named Tom Keller, who had once been Harris's most trusted lieutenant. Laura found him at a dive bar on the edge of town, nursing a whiskey like it was medicine. He didn't flinch when she slid into the booth across from him. You already know, don't you? Keller said, his voice gravelly. I saw the tapes. You wouldn't be here otherwise. Laura leaned forward. Then tell me, why? Why did you stay quiet? His eyes glistened with shame. Because Harris owned us. Owned everything. If I spoke up, my career was over. My family, they'd have been ruined. I thought I could live with it. But then 4 of them died in one night. That ain't something you live with. That's something that kills you slow. He handed her a flash drive. I kept copies. Records. Med logs. He doesn't know I took them. That's your smoking gun. Laura closed her fist around the drive, her pulse racing. She had what she needed. Evidence of a conspiracy that ran deeper than anyone dared to admit. Coldwater wasn't just a prison anymore. It was a machine built to exploit, control, and destroy. And for the first time, Laura could see the gears turning. The flash drive from Keller had confirmed Laura's worst fear. The infirmary wasn't a sanctuary, it was a weapon. The logs showed injections administered at odd hours, medicines not listed in official supply records, and doses that didn't match the women's conditions. Each entry was signed with the same name, Elaine Porter. The night the 4 women died, the infirmary logs showed something chilling. Each one had been scheduled for routine observation within hours of their deaths. On paper, it looked ordinary. But the timestamps lined up too perfectly with what the cameras caught. Porter slipping into their cells after Harris had already visited. Detective Holloway sat back in his chair, shaking his head. Routine observation? At 2 in the morning? No nurse does rounds at that hour unless she's told to. Laura stared at the screen. She wasn't observing. She was delivering the final blow. The footage from that night, synced with the logs, painted a horror movie in slow motion. At 1:50 a.m., Elaine Porter walked into Unit D carrying a tray covered with white cloth. Her posture was stiff, her movements efficient. She moved from cell to cell like a surgeon on autopilot. Inside Angela's cell, the camera caught Angela gripping her stomach, her face twisted in pain. She crawled to the bars, banging weakly, her mouth open in a silent scream. Porter never hesitated. She pressed a syringe to Angela's arm, held it there, then stood watching as Angela's body convulsed. Minutes later, the young mother-to-be lay still. Laura froze the video. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the computer. She watched her die, Laura whispered. No hesitation, no remorse. Marisol was next. The camera caught her crossing herself again and again, clutching her wooden cross until her knuckles turned white. Porter bent over, injected her, and stepped back as Marisol's prayers faltered into silence. By the time Porter reached Tasha, the young woman was pacing, pounding at the door, screaming for help. Without audio, the camera couldn't capture the words, but her mouth formed the same plea over and over. Don't do this. Please, don't do this. Porter forced her down, the needle plunging deep. Minutes later, Tasha's body went limp, her hand still pressed against the bars. Finally, there was Clara. Unlike the others, Clara seemed to know exactly what was coming. She stood her ground, shaking her head, her lips mouthing a defiant no, but Harris himself appeared outside her door, towering over her like a shadow. He said something that made her freeze, her shoulders sagging in resignation. Porter stepped inside, needle in hand. Clara's body buckled, then collapsed. Harris watched through the bars until it was over. Then both of them walked away, leaving the cell in silence. For women. For needles. For silenced voices. When the footage ended, Holloway rubbed his temples, his voice barely audible. Jesus Christ. This isn't just abuse. This is execution. Laura's throat tightened, her eyes burning. She thought of Angela's letters to her mother, Marisol's whispered prayers, Tasha's poems, Clara's warnings. Each woman had known something was wrong, and each had tried to survive it. But against Harris and Porter, survival had been impossible. It was no longer just a theory. The cameras and the logs told the same story. Harris ordered the cleanup, and Elaine Porter carried it out. Together, they had decided who lived and who died. Laura closed the laptop and looked at Holloway. We have the proof. The question is, can we survive bringing it forward? Because inside Coldwater, Harris still held the keys. And now they knew just how far he was willing to go to keep his secrets buried. The footage of Elaine Porter's needles was damning, but Laura McKinney knew better than to think it was enough. Harris had built his empire on intimidation and careful manipulation. If they walked into court with only blurry footage and suspicious logs, he'd bury it under legal jargon and political influence. What they needed was the one thing Harris couldn't explain away, a direct link tying his hand to the murders. And then, like a cruel twist of fate, the prison itself handed it to them. Coldwater's surveillance system wasn't perfect. Some cameras were old, some barely functional, others forgotten entirely. But one of those forgotten cameras, a tiny unit bolted to the corner of a side hallway outside the infirmary, had survived years of neglect. And it had recorded everything Harris thought he'd hidden. Laura and Holloway sat in the dim light of the DA's office as the playback rolled. The timestamp read 1:42 a.m., minutes before the first injection. The camera caught Harris walking briskly down the corridor, his silver hair glinting under the fluorescent lights. He wasn't alone. Beside him, Elaine Porter carried a small metal case. The video showed them stopping outside the supply room. Harris unlocked the door with his personal key, stepped inside, and pulled out a box of unmarked vials. He handed them to Porter, his lips moving as if giving instructions. She nodded once, clipped, like a soldier receiving orders. Then the two of them walked in the direction of Unit D. The footage wasn't just a shadow or suggestion. It was Harris, caught in the act of arming his accomplice. Holloway slammed his hand against the desk. There it is. That's the chain of command. He gave her the poison. He gave the damn order. Laura exhaled slowly, her pulse thundering in her ears. This isn't just negligence. It's conspiracy to murder. The DA, Karen Stokes, leaned back in her chair, her face pale. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she said quietly, "With this, we've got him. Harris won't walk away from this." But even as relief flooded the room, Laura felt the familiar chill of caution. Harris wasn't just any suspect. He had friends in high places, allies who owed him favors. If they moved too soon, the evidence could vanish, the witnesses could disappear, and Harris would know exactly who had turned on him. That risk became all too real when Officer Barnes, the young guard who had confessed, was found beaten in the parking lot of a grocery store 2 days later. He survived, but barely. When Laura visited him in the hospital, his jaw wired shut, he scribbled a note with trembling hands. He knows. He knows it was me. It was the confirmation she dreaded. Harris was already tightening the noose. Then we move fast, Laura told the DA. Every second we wait, he's erasing something. Or someone. The DA agreed. That night, warrants were drafted, evidence secured, and protective custody arranged for Keller, the ex-lieutenant with the flash drive. Coldwater's walls, once a fortress for Harris, were about to close in on him instead. But Harris wasn't oblivious. Word spread through the prison like wildfire. Guards whispered about raids. Inmates shouted through the bars. And in the warden's office, Harris sat behind his oak desk with a look that was more steel than flesh. "They think they can outmaneuver me," he muttered to Porter, who stood by his side. "They don't understand. I am this prison. Without me, it falls apart." But for the first time, the cameras, his silent allies, had turned against him. And now, they weren't just watching. They were testifying. The tide had shifted. The question wasn't if Harris would fall. The question was how hard. By the time the case against Warden Samuel Harris went to trial, the entire state was watching. News vans lined the courthouse steps, their satellite dishes rising like steel trees. Protesters carried signs reading "Justice for the Four" and "Prisons are not hunting grounds." Families of the victims stood in the crowd, clutching photographs of Angela, Marisol, Tasha, and Clara. Inside, the courtroom was packed to the rafters. Every seat taken, reporters scribbling notes, cameras snapping the instant Harris entered. He wore a dark suit, his posture upright, his face carved in stone. To anyone who didn't know the truth, he looked like a man wronged, a public servant dragged into scandal. But to Laura McKinney, seated behind the prosecution's table, he looked like exactly what he was, a predator in polished shoes. District Attorney Karen Stokes wasted no time in setting the tone. She rose before the jury, her voice sharp, unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about coincidence. It is not about medical complications. It is about power. Samuel Harris used his authority not to protect the women of Coldwater Penitentiary, but to exploit, terrorize, and ultimately silence them. For women, for unborn children, gone, because they dared to exist under his rule." She gestured toward the screen as the first damning video played. The jury leaned forward as Harris appeared in grainy black and white, unlocking the supply room, handing unmarked vials to Elaine Porter. The silence in the room was thick. When the video ended, Stokes delivered the final blow. "The cameras do not lie. Harris thought he was above the law. Today, we prove he is not." Harris's attorney, a slick man in a tailored suit, countered with all the polish money could buy. He painted Harris as a scapegoat, a man caught in the crossfire of a system eager for someone to blame. "Do you truly believe," he asked the jury, "that a decorated warden would risk everything, his career, his reputation, by orchestrating such crimes?" My client was doing his duty. The real tragedy here is that medical complications were twisted into a witch hunt. He pointed at the detectives. These officers needed a villain, and they chose the man in charge. But the defense unraveled when the witnesses began to speak. Officer Eddie Barnes, still limping from the attack that nearly killed him, took the stand. His voice shook, but his words cut sharp. "I saw him go into those cells. I saw him give the orders. We were told to keep our mouths shut. Anyone who talked paid for it." Then came Tom Keller, the former lieutenant. He handed over the flash drive, and the courtroom gasped as medical logs and falsified reports flashed across the screens. "I served under Harris for 15 years, Keller admitted. But I couldn't live with the blood on my hands anymore. Those women died because of him, because he demanded it." Elaine Porter herself was the final nail. Facing the death penalty, she made a desperate bid for leniency by confessing. Her testimony was chilling. "He told me to do it. He put the vials in my hands. He said those pregnancies were liabilities, that the women had to be silenced before anyone outside found out." The courtroom went silent, but the silence didn't last long. The defense attorney shot to his feet, his voice cutting through the tension. "Objection, Your Honor. This so-called confession is nothing more than an act of desperation. My client never ordered this. Ms. Porter is trying to save her own life." The judge raised a hand. "Overruled. The witness will continue." Elaine Porter's hands shook on the stand. For the first time, she looked directly at Harris. "You promised me protection," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You said no one would ever know. You said the cameras wouldn't matter." All eyes turned to Harris. He didn't move, didn't blink, but his jaw tightened, and a vein pulsed in his temple. DA Karen Stokes seized the moment. She rose slowly, walking toward the jury, her voice low but deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, you just heard it. Not from an officer afraid of retaliation. Not from a detective building a case. From the very woman who carried out the injections. Harris wasn't just aware, he commanded it. He orchestrated it." She turned sharply, pointing toward Harris. "Look at him. He's not shocked. He's not outraged. He's calm because this was always part of his plan. To exploit. To silence. To kill." The defense tried to object again, but the words drowned beneath the jury's shifting bodies, their faces tight with anger and disgust. One juror leaned forward, staring directly at Harris as if he were already guilty. Harris finally broke his silence. Leaning toward his attorney, he muttered, But the microphone picked up enough. She was weak. She failed. Gasps erupted. The families of the victims cried out, one slamming a fist against the bench. The judge banged his gavel, shouting for order, but the damage was done. The mask Harris had worn so carefully had slipped in front of everyone. Detective McKinney glanced at Holloway, her heart pounding. She didn't need to say it aloud. That single sentence had just sealed Harris's fate. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shouts, tears. Harris sat motionless, his jaw clenched, but a flicker of fear crossed his eyes for the first time. Laura McKinney leaned back, her heart pounding. After months of chasing shadows, the truth was finally spoken aloud, in the place where it mattered most. When the prosecution rested, the jury didn't deliberate long. The weight of the evidence was too heavy, the testimony too damning. The trial hadn't just been about Harris. It had been about exposing a system that allowed one man's power to eclipse humanity. And as the gavel struck, the state knew it had witnessed not just justice, but a reckoning. The jury filed back into the courtroom after only 4 hours of deliberation. In cases this complex, verdicts usually stretched into days. But no one was surprised by the speed. The evidence had been overwhelming, the testimony devastating. The entire room rose as the jurors took their seats, the tension crackling like electricity. Families of the victims clutched hands so tightly their knuckles turned white. Madam Foreperson, the judge asked, has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? Yes, Your Honor, she replied, her voice steady. She passed the folded slip of paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to the bench. The judge scanned the words, then read aloud. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant, Samuel Harris, guilty. On the charge of 4 counts of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, guilty. On the charge of abuse of power under color of law, we find the defendant, guilty. Gasps filled the room, followed by sobs of relief. Angela's mother broke down, clutching her daughter's photo to her chest. Marisol's brother wrapped his arm around his father, both men weeping openly. Tasha's aunt whispered, "Justice, baby, justice." Clara's husband bowed his head, tears dripping onto the wooden pew. For Laura McKinney, the words landed like a weight lifted from her chest. Months of chasing shadows, fighting resistance, and staring into the faces of the dead, all of it had led to this moment. Beside her, Holloway closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. Harris didn't flinch as the verdicts were read. He sat ramrod straight, his jaw locked. But his eyes betrayed him, cold defiance replaced by the first flicker of dread. When the judge announced his sentence, life without the possibility of parole, the room erupted in applause. Reporters scribbled furiously, flashes from cameras lighting the chamber like fireworks. Elaine Porter's fate was decided days later. She was sentenced to death by lethal injection, her final plea for mercy rejected. When she heard the ruling, she wept, not for the women she'd killed, but for herself. For the first time in her career, Laura felt no sympathy. Porter had been a nurse sworn to heal, yet she had become an instrument of death. As Harris was led away in shackles, a reporter shouted over the chaos, "Warden, do you have anything to say to the families?" He turned, his face pale but hard, and muttered, "I kept order." They never understood. The words only fueled the fury of the crowd. Shouts of anger echoed through the halls. Monster! Murderer! Justice at last! Outside the courthouse, the families gathered together, for sets of loved ones united by grief but bound by victory. Angela's mother spoke to the cameras, her voice trembling. They thought these women were forgotten. They thought nobody would care. But today, their voices were heard. Marisol's brother added, "We can't bring them back. But at least the man who stole their lives will never hurt anyone again." Detective McKinney stood at a distance, watching the families embrace. She felt a rush of emotion she hadn't allowed herself for months. Relief, sadness, anger, but above all, pride that the truth had prevailed. Holloway joined her, his voice low. "You did it, Laura. We did it." She shook her head. "No, they did it." Angela, Marisol, Tasha, Clara, they refused to be silenced. Even in death, they told their story. We just had to listen. As the courthouse emptied, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and red. It was a fitting backdrop to the day, a day that would be remembered not just as the fall of a powerful man, but as the triumph of truth over corruption. But for the families walking home with photographs instead of daughters, the victory was bittersweet. Justice had come, but at a cost that could never be repaid. The courthouse had emptied, the reporters packed up their cameras, and the chance of protesters faded into the distance. But for those who lived through the nightmare of Coldwater, the story didn't end with a guilty verdict. Justice had been served, but scars remained, deep, invisible, and permanent. Angela Carter's mother still kept her daughter's letters folded in a small wooden box. Every Sunday, she opened them, tracing Angela's handwriting with trembling fingers. "This baby is my second chance," one letter read. The baby never came, but her mother clung to those words like a prayer. She believed in tomorrow, she told a reporter months later. And Harris stole that from her. Marisol's father carried her rosary in his pocket everywhere he went. He spoke only Spanish, but when asked about his daughter, he pressed the wooden beads into a journalist's hand and whispered, "Ella rezaba cada noche. Nadia escucho." She prayed every night. No one listened. Tasha's aunt transformed her grief into action. She founded a nonprofit called Voices Behind Bars, dedicated to monitoring prison abuse cases. "They thought she was just another statistic," she said at the launch event, her voice breaking. But Tasha was a poet. She wanted to be a mother. Now her words will live on. And Clara's husband, a quiet man broken by loss, left flowers on the prison gates every year on the anniversary of her death. A nurse's uniform button rested on the bouquet, a reminder of the life Clara once had before the prison consumed her. For Detectives McKinney and Holloway, the case left a permanent shadow. Laura returned to work, but nothing felt the same. Coldwater haunted her dreams. The grainy images of women begging, praying, screaming. She could still see them every time she closed her eyes. "You don't come back from this," she told Holloway one night over coffee. "Not completely. You just learn to live with ghosts." Holloway nodded. "Maybe, but at least these ghosts can finally rest." Coldwater Penitentiary itself became a symbol. Investigations unearthed more corruption, leading to mass resignations and criminal charges against other staff. Eventually, the state shut it down. The sprawling gray walls were left to rot, an abandoned monument to cruelty. Nature began reclaiming it, vines climbing the concrete, grass breaking through the cracks in the yard. Local kids whispered that the place was haunted, and in a way, it was. But the cameras, the very ones Harris had once relied on for control, outlived him. Clips of the trial and the damning footage spread across the country. Documentaries dissected every frame. Talk shows debated prison reform, women's rights behind bars, and the abuse of unchecked power. Coldwater wasn't just a crime scene anymore. It was a mirror held up to a nation that had too often ignored the voices of the voiceless. In her final statement to the press, DA Karen Stokes said it best. "Those cameras were silent, but they saw everything. They saw the truth Harris tried to bury. And they proved something vital, that no matter how powerful the predator, the victims will always find a way to speak." Years later, a memorial was erected in the town square, for silhouettes etched in stone, each one with an empty cradle at their feet. Beneath it, the inscription read, "They were silenced in life, but not in history. Angela, Marisol, Tasha, Clara, we remember." On the day the memorial was unveiled, Laura McKinney stood in the crowd. She didn't cry. She had cried enough in the long nights of investigation, but she felt a quiet, unshakable pride. Justice had come too late for 4 women and their unborn children, but their story had changed something. Their suffering had forced people to look, to listen, to act. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the memorial, Laura whispered the words she wished she could say to them directly. "You mattered. You always mattered. And now the whole world knows it." The case of Coldwater Penitentiary would never be forgotten. It wasn't just a story of death. It was a story of power exposed, silence broken, and justice, finally, delivered. In the weeks that followed the verdict, Coldwater's story spread far beyond the small southern town. National news outlets replayed the trial highlights, panelists debated the failures of prison oversight, and talk shows interviewed grieving families. For the first time in years, the country was forced to look directly at the conditions of women behind bars. Advocacy groups seized the moment. Petitions flooded the governor's office demanding reforms, Independent oversight committees, stricter background checks for wardens and staff, mandatory mental health resources for inmates. Politicians who had once praised Harris for his discipline and order now scrambled to distance themselves, their silence replaced by promises of sweeping change. But reform didn't come without resistance. Some officials dismissed the tragedy as an isolated incident, arguing that Coldwater was one corrupt facility, not a reflection of the entire system. Yet survivors and families refused to let the narrative fade. Angela's mother spoke at rallies, holding her daughter's letters aloft. Marisol's brother addressed Congress in halting English, pleading that no family should ever endure what theirs had. Tasha's aunt made headlines when she confronted a state senator on live television, demanding accountability. For weeks, the images dominated every screen. The memorial with 4 empty cradles, the courtroom sketch of Harris receiving his sentence, the footage of Porter with her tray of needles. They became symbols of a larger question. How many other prisons hid similar horrors that simply hadn't been exposed? Detective McKinney watched it all from the sidelines. She gave no interviews, issued no statements. But in the quiet of her apartment, she clipped the articles and stacked them in a folder labeled Coldwater. It wasn't pride that drove her to keep them. It was remembrance, a vow that the names Angela, Marisol, Tasha, and Clara would never be lost to the blur of headlines. Coldwater was closed, the walls abandoned, but its echo remained. And that echo traveled farther than Harris ever imagined, reshaping not only a town, but an entire nation's conversation about justice, power, and the hidden lives of women behind bars.